This is episode 223 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, we had another update from our governor here on the COVID-19 situation.
Everything's going well. We're going to open everything up and not talk about it ever again.
Well, half of that statement is true. Things are certainly going in the right direction. The latest data we have from our handy-dandy New York Times COVID-19 tracker is that on August the 16th, the number of new cases was 106. That is well down from just July 29th, when the number of new cases was 345. That was kind of the 7-day rolling peak. The 7-day average at that time was 330 cases a day. We are down now to about half of that at 156 cases per day on the rolling 7-day average. It makes sense to do these things in a 7-day rolling average in order to smooth out some of the high peaks and low lows. The highest we ever had in a day was July 27th when we had 449 new cases in New Mexico. So things are definitely trending in the right direction. The governor's tone has taken a turn for the better in general in our weekly or whatever they are reports. Wally, before I throw it over to you, not much news. She had a long presentation about the census and why people need to fill out those forms. We're fine with the census and filling out those forms. Wish New Mexico wasn't so reliant on federal dollars, but still fill out your census. It is one of the few constitutionally required, mandated things that our government does these days. The only other kind of big development is gators are bad. And I'm not talking about the gators that'll eat you if you go down to the wrong waterway down in Florida. I'm talking about a piece of clothing that will go just beneath your kind of bottom half of your face, covering your mouth and nose. It is a type of face protection, aka a mask, that apparently doesn't necessarily work as well as some of the others, although it's one study and you just, with these mass situations these days, it's hard to really say definitively whether gators are good or bad, but that's the governor's take on things. So that was the biggest news item. No opening though, Wally, and kids are in school, well, virtually in school, and here we are.
Yeah, it's interesting. Virtually has two meanings. So we're virtually in school, meaning we're almost in school, or we're going to do it not being in person. We'll see how that all works out. It is very interesting, this whole mask thing. And a key to science, Paul, did you know it's replicability of the experiment? So it'll be interesting to see if somebody else does an experiment. We've been all over the place on these masks from the time early on. And you know what, Paul, I'm old enough to remember when they told us not to buy masks because they were needed for the first responders and healthcare providers. And then it was any mask will do. Now we're being a little more picky. And these studies, I don't know. I saw a physician who actually was using vape and put various kinds of masks on, and he would take the vape in as a way to demonstrate what the vapor of your lungs looked like coming out. And it was very interesting. So, places that have a lot of mask use, this is a little more complicated than everyone seems to indicate. If it's any consolation, Paul, guess what my primary form of face covering was? Number
Brown
one,
paper bag.
No, number one was a gator. I loved my gator because I could breathe through it. And then number two was a bandana. Both are on the naughty list now. So I'm going to have to find another mask, I guess, that I like that works well. Again, I'm not a never masker, but I'm getting conflicting information fatigue on these masks. So
Yeah, and the COVID-19 report this week will be relatively short, although a new report from Wallet Hub came out. According to them, New Mexico is the 34th most open state in the nation, which is pretty hard to believe considering I would say that we seem very restricted compared to other states I've traveled to over the last month, but that information is getting a little old. It just seems like New Mexico, from what people are saying, is relatively shut down. One of the things that they have at the Wallet Hub report that's really interesting, and it's blogged up at the errorsofenchantment.com, is they rank fewest restrictions, they rank most restrictions, then they rank death rate by most and least. And then they correlate them. And New Mexico falls into the category of states labeled as most restricted and highest death rate. Not where you want to be. You want to be in ideally least restricted and lowest death rate.
Yeah.
That's kind of like getting your lunch and eating it too. We are in the no soup for you, and you're going to have a lot of problems.
And I'm going to take your money and not give you soup. So
yeah,
yes, and that is. I saw that thing about death rate per 100,000, where everything's going relatively well right now, but if you look at that as a kind of common size way. Not to belabor the point, but a lot of these statistics are only so comparable because you would think what's a COVID death would be relatively easy to determine. Well, there's 50 different states plus the District of Columbia and our territories that all use a little bit different way. The percentage of people who have tests that have COVID, it depends a lot on how many people are getting the test and what that composition is. So the data and the science is a little bit hard to come by, but I saw that as well. And we're not doing as well as you would have thought, given how shut down we have been in New Mexico. The last I heard, only one of 3 states that does not have restaurants open for.
Good evening and welcome to the Heritage Action Sentinel Strategy.
Sorry about that, Paul. I had something else hooked up to the soundboard there. No, we're one of the few states that does not have restaurants open for indoor dining. To the best of my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you're a bowling alley, you're still not open, right? You've never. Why do we hate bowling so much? It would seem like you could bowl with a little bit, every other lane. I don't know, 50% occupancy.
Main event.
Main event.
Cliffs.
All of those.
Dave and Buster's.
Yeah.
Chuck E. Cheese. I could go on.
We could go on, but they've never been opened. And so, a lot of those places, if you're closed for a certain amount of time, you may never reopen. And so I really do feel for those. I think there are places that are now open that are maybe less dangerous than those. One of those being, hair salons. I've gotten my hair cut twice since in the post-opening phase, and obviously there's some closeness, at least between the customer and the barber, the hairdresser that's doing things. So there's still some inconsistency here in New Mexico, and I don't know. We seem like we're doing pretty well, but it also, I get the sense that however well we do, there's always another layer of an achievement we have to get to before there's always a new statistic. And it was interesting the other day is that we were green in everything except for average cases, new cases, to be determined later. So it's kind of like, what is that about? So it's like, if there's science and if there's some data, wouldn't you kind of know what that is, or do you just make it up as you go along?
Well, I'm not going to...
These are all important questions. I don't expect answers to all of these.
I think it's safe to say that there is a lot of smoke and mirrors going on. And I will say, to be fair, not only is there smoke and mirrors going on in terms of what number we can use to change the direction and go forward in terms of opening New Mexico, but how we actually track these numbers. I just have no faith in, when you look at the U.S. and everybody says we're so terrible, yeah, I think Europe is generally doing things right when it comes to the tracking. But do you trust the Chinese data? Do you trust a lot of these other
The Russian
Asian
data.
The Russian data?
North Korea has yet to have a case.
Amazingly
right?
enough.
Amazing.
South America has been really ravaged in recent months. It's just really hard to figure out who is tracking these things consistently and what's actually going on. So anyway, we'll leave that behind. There's more COVID-19 updates to talk about, I'm sure, in the future, but we're not going to talk about COVID-19 by and large through the rest of the podcast. So we are going to talk about Bernalillo County. We mentioned last week and had a conversation with Carla Kugler at the Associated Builders and Contractors about project labor agreement legislation at Bernalillo County. We are expecting a final vote on that as early as September 22nd, 2020. You can go online to the Errors of Enchantment webpage and look at more information about project labor agreements, why they're a bad idea. There's even a short video available. You can email your Bernalillo County commissioners. I think this is one where we genuinely can win. We had 2 commissioners vote against the introduction of the project labor agreement. It basically says if you have a public work project in this county, you have to use union labor, and 92% of New Mexico's construction laborers are not union members. So it's something that just makes no sense for us to do. But moving forward and talking about kind of this nexus here of economic issues and policy issues, as we move hopefully beyond the COVID-19, one of the things that, John Boyd, we talked to him, a site selector, a while back, the idea that the workplace is increasingly going to be not dependent, or where you live is not going to be dependent on where you work. You can increasingly work virtually with no office space or just a home office, and that can be how you do your job. And people could work anywhere practically in the world. You might have to work a weird schedule if you're living in Tokyo and you're supposed to be in the office in New York. You might be a night owl, but the fact is that people likely will increasingly have a lot more freedom in terms of places to go. And some business folks were talking about this. Channel 4 KOB TV story discussed the issue. And Wally, I'd love your impact, your input here. The business group said, here are our strengths: low cost of living, low property taxes, good infrastructure for workforce training, and nice weather. Those are the pros. I added unique culture and cuisine, and the number of outdoor activities: skiing, golf, hiking, etc. Now, the negatives are substantial: high crime, bad K-12 system, high overall taxes, with gross receipts tax being the notable one, and possible challenges for GRTs on out-of-state workers. Broadband service that we're seeing is a challenge for school children right now. Geographical isolation. You don't have any professional sports teams of note. I mean, New Mexico United are one, but we're talking about major league sports. And it's not easy to get to those games. You have to pretty much, you can drive up to Denver for a football game, but that's a long hike. Same with Phoenix. And then you really don't have any big city vibe anywhere. We're presuming that these are young, predominantly single type folks who want the urban amenities. Now, those urban amenities, who knows, that's going to change dramatically. But No one will
Well, and
ever
there's two
mistake.
kinds of big city vibe. I'm not sure any big city has the good big city vibe anymore.
Not right now, no.
And we certainly don't here in New Mexico and in Albuquerque. We kind of
We never have.
Well, and I don't know about never. I hear that between 1956 and halfway through 1957, we had that in New Mexico for about a year and a half.
All right.
It was before I was born, so we don't have that. No, it's a decent list. The workforce training, I think here's my response to that. Because most of those workforce training things require there to be a workforce in New Mexico, and so if you're the one or two or three people working for a company here in New Mexico, the overhead of those programs, of those work training programs, are very tough to come by. The other thing that is interesting, that'll be another thing that plays out, is there's two kinds of workers. There's employees that live anywhere working as employees, and then there's the so-called gig culture, or independent consultants and contractors that work. And I'm sort of thinking that maybe to be an employee in New Mexico working outside might be a little better. Although, the pet peeve of mine, gross receipts tax,
Right.
you can structure your affairs as a service provider, as a contractor, to not pay that as long as the use of your labor is out of state. So maybe that one's not so bad. But the thing, what would you call?
Well, hold
it?
on. Let me jump
Yeah.
in before you.
Oh, yeah, before
So
I
the
go
U.S.
further.
Supreme Court had a decision about internet taxation. It had to deal with, because the issue with internet taxation was never that the states or Congress got together and said, we're not going to tax internet sales.
Right.
It was always about something called nexus, which means that if Amazon, they have a warehouse, they have some facility in most states. They hadn't previously in New Mexico, but Wally's home pot holder business, if you had that running here in New Mexico and you sold your pot holders all across the country and shipped them via the mail or whatever, you did not have nexus. You were not going to be taxed.
As long as you didn't have a location in the
Right.
state you're shipping to.
So that all changed, and I have concerns.
But that's for just products. So services, a lot of states don't tax services as all, so that's not the case. So, but the point is, it's complicated.
Right.
It's complicated, and there are a lot of rules, and it's this sort of thing that regulations that are complicated, a lot of people won't even know they exist. And what happens to those people? They tend to run into a lot of trouble before they know something happens. Paul, I deal with people probably a half a dozen a year, if not more, that I'll talk to them in various things. I'll meet them in some format. Say, oh, yeah, I'm new to New Mexico, and I do this service business. And it's like, oh, how do you like our gross receipts tax? And usually it's like, huh? It's like, you better find out what that is, because that's 7.875% in Albuquerque that you probably weren't charging people that you owe the state of New Mexico that you need to figure out about. So not to get too deep in the weeds, but yes, we're good on some things. This is a great place to live. If you like the outdoors, there's a lot of cool outdoor activities. But what do you call the blocking and tackling? And what I'll say, maybe crime and crime and education.
Those are two big ones.
Yeah, I mean, those are mine. I would say crime, education, and taxes, but in this kind of work anywhere, live anywhere, I think crime and education have to be close. And if you're going to say which is the most important, I think you have to say crime, because a lot of people who are in this situation that I know are either, they tend to be, not always, they tend to be relatively young doing this kind of consultative type business, or they tend to be a little older. More people in the middle seem like they have more what we call traditional employment relationships. So we're back to crime again. And where are we on crime? Have we even had an update from anybody? Did we even talk about crime anymore in New Mexico? Or is that just I mean, we could be doing better for all I know, in which case we should be talking about it. I have a feeling we're not, because nobody's talked about it.
Well, I think the crime situation right now is extremely different and odd, because so many people are being told to stay home, and
Well, maybe we should tell those people to not steal and to not kill people when the COVID is over. Don't you think that could be a crime strategy?
It's kind of like the whole gun issue, you know. The people who don't obey the laws are probably not obeying the quarantine laws.
Yeah.
The people who are obeying them probably are, not going to go out and commit the crimes. But that is, it is a real issue here, public safety, et cetera, and definitely something that I think will present challenges. Now, Albuquerque's not the entire state. There's other places around around New Mexico that people could live and could be as nearby as Rio Rancho, or could be down in Las Cruces or somewhere else. And then you get into the broadband issues.
I was just going to say, yeah, you have to be able to
or
get
airport, because if you're moving here from somewhere else and you want to travel back to visit family or your business, it's a challenge to get to other places if you're not living in the metro area to have access to the Sunport.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the broadband. I have an associate colleague who installs like huge satellite broadband connections for people that are very remote, and they work fantastic, by the way.
Sure.
The problem is they are very expensive.
Yep.
So you think you would pay a lot for internet, at the Guessing household or at the Rio Grande Foundation. This is usually between 5, 10, 20 times as much. But, so you have to have a pretty successful business to make that piece of overhead work out. But yeah, then we were back to broadband and what that does. So, what's your gut tell you, Paul, right now in terms of where would New Mexico fare on this relative to other states? And I mean, I know that this maybe is the anathema of the data-oriented logic of the Rio Grande Foundation, but some of these things before there is data, there is a little bit of intuition. Do you think that this is something that we can capitalize on, or is this going to be another foregone opportunity for New Mexico?
Well, it all depends on what you're actually looking for. If you're no kids and you are big into the outdoor activities, and maybe your price point is on the lower side, because Denver is much more pricey, property values, all those kinds of things. It gets a lot pricier. Not every area is like that, but certainly a lot of the more favorable areas in Phoenix and Scottsdale and those kinds of places are more expensive.
Tucson it's no low cost of living hub either.
Yeah,
so.
And traffic, I guess, is another one we didn't mention. That's relatively reasonable here in Albuquerque, no matter what. So there's, if you're not commuting, if you're working out of your home office, traffic is probably not a big issue, but there's people who drive for other reasons besides their day-to-day commute. So I think we probably are going to benefit somewhat from this trend, depending on how big it really is and how many folks really do leave some of these bigger cities. Being in New York City is great when you're able to walk everywhere. You don't have kids. And I lived in the DC area, so it's not New York, but it's close. And
you have the metro, and most people don't have cars for lots of reasons.
But it loses its charm very quickly when your local bar, your local restaurant, your local single scene, or your social events are kind of taken away from you. So if this is something that continues for a very long period of time, and New York is the one I think that's in many ways ground zero for kind of these challenges.
Facing a big exodus, right?
Yeah.
And
so I think
California's probably number 2, I would think.
Well, California's had some problems with the rioting. I wouldn't say, California has not had the impact of the virus itself in terms of the deaths. It's been relatively unimpacted, but certainly there's a lot of factors right now making.
Well, California can't even keep the lights on, and then I read today about California imposing a durable kind of wealth tax on its wealthiest people to discourage them from living in California. And so, if something is a what will I call it? Innovative policy. It can be innovative good, or it can be innovative crazy. Sure. California is very likely to be one of the first to try it. So,
well, we're definitely talk about the whole electricity thing, and New Mexico definitely adopted some policies here recently at the PRC. Of course, Energy Transition Act initially that could really impact our electricity reliability down the road. Of course, we've got to almost, maybe 20 years before we perhaps have some of those kinds of problems, but we'll see. California is not that close. They're not that close to 100% or anything on their RPS. They're much more, I don't know, 30, 40%. You don't need to be going for 100% renewables to have the kinds of problems that California is having with its electricity grid. You can, have on the margins those wild swings in electricity from the wind and solar plants or stations. Those cause dramatic problems much earlier than people think in terms of the percentage there on the grid.
Yeah, and right now in the Western grid, there is a lot of grid stability that's being provided by coal plants that are scheduled to shut down in the not too distant future. And then, what replaces those? P&M wanted to replace some of theirs with a gas-fired power plant. That was so far round one that was rejected, and so they're going with batteries. And on the battery front, Paul, I read a detailed report of the APS battery fire that I'll have to share with you, and maybe we
Arizona Public Service,
not Albuquerque Public Schools. Thank you, Arizona. Thank you, Arizona Public Service. And I don't know if you ever watched the HBO show about Chernobyl. Okay, this is like mini Chernobyl. There are these whole series of things that they didn't account for that cascaded. And unlike Chernobyl, it didn't cause a massive nuclear radiation leak or whatever, but there was a failure that they totally did not expect to have happen. And there were a lot of things that were done that, at the time they did them, they probably looked relatively reasonable, or else were overridden by an engineer that had the power or the pressure to keep costs down. And so, the big thing, the way New Mexico is going right now is, there's certainly projects like the Enchant Energy project to keep San Juan generating open. Boy, if that thing doesn't go, New Mexico right now, we need to light the votive candle of prayer that these batteries work, because, P&M in New Mexico is placing a lot of faith on a only moderately tested technology. No, do batteries exist in the electric grid today? Absolutely. Do they in anything from a percentage point of view or a scale like what's being proposed here in New Mexico? Not at all. And so will bad things happen? We will have to wait and see, but they have happened elsewhere. And like you say, California is already having their problems from a policy point of view, very complicated. And it's not fun when the lights are out, and it's not fun when your electric rates go up 40%, and it's really not fun when they both happen at the same time, like in California.
Yeah, and the air conditioning is off. See, I can live without lights, especially during the hours of 10 p.m. to about 7 or 8 a.m.
Or even during the day if our laptop has batteries.
That's true,
right?
But it's the air conditioning that is a real kick in the pants. If the reason it is going out more than likely, of course, your electricity generation is much more emphasized during the summer. Pretty much your air conditioning unit really is the cost driver for your electricity bill in the summertime. And that's where you miss it immediately if the electricity goes out, because it gets pretty hot pretty quickly. I know there's a lot of people out there with adobe houses and some, nice green building that's being done. But in New Mexico, if you're looking at 90, 95, 100 or more degrees, it's going to get real hot real quick without air conditioning on.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And, the other thing that happens is if your air conditioning's out for a long period of time, remember back when Chicago and the upper Midwest would have their heat waves. Back then, a lot of people did not have air conditioning, and just what a health hazard it is for the same sort of people that the COVID's a health hazard.
Yep.
If you have underlying conditions and it's 92 degrees in your house, you might not be able to weather the storm. So it can become big, much less people who have, oxygen generators and other things keeping them going. So I will say P&M, from a P&M point of view, the reliability at a a retail level in terms of the reliability, how often the power goes out. I've seen some statistics in how good it's gotten over the years. That can be a mixed blessing. You know, it's like if you get the idea that the power can never go off and then things happen in the system from external forces, it can cause a lot more problems than if people are like, oh, yeah, we need to be prepared if the power goes out. I think people haven't had what, you know, are euphemistically called in the electric industry, electric appreciation days, as often as maybe healthy from the point of view of people preparing for what would happen if I didn't have it for a day or a week. Something that in South Florida with hurricane season, everybody knows about. Not in the desert Southwest, at least in the last, 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
Very true. All right. Well, the issue of unemployment benefits and federal dollars for those benefits has been pretty controversial here recently. And interesting development. Of course, we talked a little bit about the Trump executive order, more along the political lines. Whether it's constitutional or not, I think is a very open question. But the nuance here with regard to President Trump's executive order as it pertains to unemployment benefits is really interesting. Of course, we had been dealing with a $600 unemployment benefit addition thanks to the CARES Act and COVID-19. Then there was questions of, well, do we keep that going past July 31st? And the answer, at least tentatively, is not exactly. The president wanted to go with $400 in this executive order. $300 of that would come from the federal government, and the president was hoping $100 would come from the states. Now, remember, this is Governor Lujan Grisham tweeting as the days tick down to July 31st, and unemployment benefit at that level, $600 was going away. She tweeted, "Congressional Republicans want to provide even less to New Mexicans who need all the assistance they can get during this public health and economic emergency. This isn't a partisan issue. It's about provision of basic government services to meet the needs of constituents." So I think for all of the flaws with this executive order and everything going on in Washington, Trump essentially called BS on people like Governor Lujan Grisham and said, look, we'll give you $300. You should provide an extra $100. And you know exactly what happened. We're going to get $300 here in New Mexico. And that extra $100 from the state of New Mexico will not be going to workers or non-workers, people who are unemployed, their paychecks. And it's what we've said all along, that some of these states, including New Mexico, are basing policy decisions relating to the virus on and shutting down your economy on the assumption that Washington's just going to be there with their unlimited money tree in the backyard to bail everybody out, and that they don't have to put up any money at all. And I think that has been a fascinating exercise.
Yeah, and so far this game of chicken with the feds has worked. Mm-hmm. I would have to say I'm not happy about it, but from a point of view as the feds have written lots and lots of checks in it, but the dollar, our fiscal situation, our accumulation of debt is getting, I don't know is it critical? Who knows? I thought it would have been critical $5 or $10 trillion ago. So I was wrong. I will go on record to say I thought it would be a lot worse before now, but it is not limitless. It's one of those, the mathematics of the thing is you cannot continue to go on forever and do this, or your currency will be debauched and you will have huge problems. So, I've heard financial commentators talk about that this is a worldwide problem. We may be seeing a massive reset, and who's going to come out the best is who's prepared to deal with it to come out of it first. New Mexico is always taking the wait and see approach. Our ratio of dollars to Washington versus dollars coming back are amongst the that ratio amongst the highest. We're usually 1 or 2 every year, and that is a well-worn strategy that will work until it doesn't work anymore. So we'll have to see. Oh, and by the way, how could Congress pass anything? The House isn't even in session right now. So
Well, the House is coming back to discuss the post office, and we're going to get to that in just a minute.
okay, very good. But they weren't even there to vote for something. So
they have their recess this time of year. Pretty much always, Congress always has a recess in August, and August has a reputation in Washington D.C., justified or not, that it is just a terrible time to be there. I mean, it's always hot and humid in the summertime.
The literal swamp, not the figurative swamp.
Yes. It's not the most pleasant time, and so traditionally they've always vacated Washington D.C. in the August month, and I do know that Pelosi's brought them back or bringing them back to discuss the post office, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes.
Very good.
But before we get into that, there is a constitutional amendment on the ballot this fall, and we're rapidly approaching November. I wanted to get someone who knows these things, because it's not a clear cut. A lot of the things we talk about here, Wally, are pretty clear cut issues if you think about them in a free market perspective. What should be done in the PRC in terms of how it's managed and who elects them or whether they're appointed, that kind of thing. So we had an expert on these issues, Rio Grande Foundation adjunct scholar Kenneth Costello, who writes extensively about utility issues and will be a guest in a few weeks on Tipping Point, New Mexico. He wrote an issue brief that's available at the riograndefoundation.org or Errors of Enchantment pages, should the governor appoint PRC commissioners. And the long and short of it is that he believes that a 3-person appointed PRC is the best option that we have. Ultimately, the political will, the best approach, the most expertise is found in a appointed by the governor system. You don't have people running for office in 5 districts across the state. He thinks that's too many. He'll explain all the ins and outs, and we'll talk more extensively about various aspects of utilities and the PRC, et cetera, on that particular podcast. But Wally, I don't know if you've definitely done your work on utilities over the years. Any thoughts on how the PRC should be organized? Should it be an appointed body with the governor in charge, or should it be a elected with districts like we have in the past?
Well, I would say the analysis you went over in general is correct. Mm-hmm. That the best utility commissioners tend to be appointed by governors. There tends to be 3 of them. That's all the study I've done, and I've looked at this issue over the years 6 times in various capacities. But I will also say that even more important than that is whether they're appointed or whether they are elected, if you have incompetent and, what shall I say, erratic and just not good commissioners, that overrides how you got them. Mm-hmm. And so, I think the data is pretty clear. That I've looked at over the years that that analysis was right. But there have been times that even in New Mexico's history, back when there were appointed commissioners, where there were a pretty rough group of appointed commissioners and you got a pretty bad outcome. There's certainly been that in the modern era of 5 elected, a commissioner who was facing drug charges and was reelected, for example, and there's just been some bad stuff happen in the elected period. So I will call it, yes, good policy in general, but not a panacea. Because if you can appoint a bad person and expect good policy and good jurisprudence, because the commissioner's a weird beast. It's part judge. It's part jury and part executioner. And so you have to have and part engineer and part attorney. And so you need a wide range of skills to do that job well. And if you have either a political, a vendetta against a group, you're for something disproportionately against it, bad things can happen no matter how they get in there. So
Yeah, and I think our logic on this tracks, broadly speaking, with the logic that then Governor Bill Richardson used to replace the PEC, Public Education Commission, with a appointed secretary. Now, there's all kinds of issues. We're not fans of the current governor, and the fact that her Secretary of Education is doing his work from Philadelphia. But the general approach of having an appointed person accountable ultimately to the governor, and the governor being accountable for those decisions, is superior to having a board that, let's face it, in New Mexico, people don't know a whole lot about, and the PEC still exists, or the PRC. People don't know many of the names that they are voting for. They don't know individually who they are, what they represent.
or if they do, they know them from another realm.
Right.
Pat Lyons was known because he was the state land commissioner and then became a public regulation commissioner. So you know him from a totally different point of view. I will give a shout out to my old professor, professor of economics from New Mexico State University back in the olden days. In the 80s, Dr. Bruce Smith, he was a utility economics professor at New Mexico State, served as an appointed commissioner. Actually, not while I was at work, but I went back and read a lot and heard a lot of things. And so, a good, solid commissioner can be a wonderful thing for a commission. But there's been bad ones under both systems in New Mexico. So, and I will say, not to be condescending, but man, you need a lot of skill and a lot of wisdom to do that job well.
Right. Just a couple things here. One is more of a housekeeping note. Recently, Catherine Stevens, our adjunct on early childhood and pre-K education, she had an opinion piece in the Albuquerque Journal. We posted it for everybody to read on errorsoфenchantment.com, as we normally do. And somebody else writing on the issue is kind of one of those, the journal likes to do omnibus or smorgasbord issues where you talk about one specific issue, and they really let people on both sides go at it. Her name was also mentioned by another author writing in the opinion section. That was on August the 11th, 2020, I believe, but at least the post, or actually the 10th, so it was posted up on the web, errorsofenchantment.com, one day later. And the post office, Wally, suddenly extremely controversial. And while we only have a few minutes remaining, I worked at the National Taxpayers Union in Washington, D.C. before I came out to New Mexico to head up the Rio Grande Foundation. National Taxpayers Union, NTU, is one of those organizations that has long advocated, and I remember working for them 15, 20 years ago, and how they were talking about ways in which we need to address seriously the Postal Service. Now, whether you think the post office should exist in its current form or largely be sold off and made part of UPS or FedEx or an independent privately held company, it just, the idea that these problems suddenly cropping up out of nowhere, and yeah, there's some seeming political shenanigans on both sides of this issue, both with the union that represents postal workers, Trump administration. I don't know, how much of that is legitimate, but the post office is a broken business model designed to mail letters. That is their profitable primary activity. They can manage package delivery till the cows come home, but they can't make a profit doing that. They just don't. That's not their system. And the idea that somehow taxpayers should be responsible for tens of billions of dollars yet again to bail out these people. I don't know where the money stops, but just because Washington can throw more money on the credit card doesn't mean that we should be doing this. The fundamental problem of the post office is its business model is broken.
Yes, and I am going to defend the post office, and I say the reason its business model is broken is that its board of directors, the Congress and the administrations over the years have totally abdicated and messed up their fiduciary responsibility to do something about it.
I would not want any business managed by Congress. It is doomed to fail.
It's doomed to fail. And this little thing called the internet came about, and in addition to package, they got it on both sides, and now they are between. In the words of "Oh brother, where art thou?" We're in a tight spot. They're definitely in a tight spot, and there's no easy answers for them.
Yeah, and it's something that should have been addressed a long time ago. I know that given the current situation in Washington, it's highly unlikely that we will see anything resembling bipartisan reform. But the fact is that both parties have held Washington in more or less unitary ways, with Republicans holding the White House and Congress, Democrats having the same. The post office, so many problems, so many things that they do wrong that you could never imagine any other business doing. For example, and we're not going to spend a lot of time here because we're not the experts. Go onto errorsofenchantment.com and see what the National Taxpayers Union's done in their written testimony in Congress and opinion pieces and whatnot. But I grew up in a neighborhood, subdivision, and it predated, the boxes that you get in many modern subdivisions.
Yeah, where you have to walk to the middle of the block or the corner
which is
to
at
get
least
your mail.
a semi-sensible way to do things. But every single day we had a mailman who had to walk our entire neighborhood and deliver mail, each individual to each house. And, you look at some of the rural communities in New Mexico. I'm sorry, if there are things that you have to give up if you want to live in the middle of nowhere. And one of those might just be the idea of getting mail delivered right to your doorstep. Now, in modern new subdivisions, you have to do a little walking. You have to get off your butt and go outside. Yes. It's such a hardship. But I just find this idea that you're entitled to have packages and letters show up at your doorstep for 50 cents now. It's Rio Grande Foundation benefits. We appreciate the people who donate to us and we send letters to and all those kinds of things. But it just is a model that, if it ever made sense, certainly doesn't make sense now in a modern economy, modern context.
No, and my final comment on this is they say there's no bipartisan agreement in Washington. Both parties can agree that we're not going to deal with the post office. We're just going to kick the can down the road, and they're going to probably do it once again. They'll do it. They'll put a Band-Aid on it, possibly this late summer, early fall, and then we'll be talking about this again, the disaster, a year or two from now.
Yeah, well, that's the way things typically go, and especially when you're printing money, and they're going to keep printing money up there in Washington, D.C. until they can't print any more money, and then that'll be an interesting time in America. All right, folks, thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.